This talk is loosely based on an exhibition that opened in 2016 on the 500th anniversary of the death of Hieronymus Bosch. The first thing to say is that we actually know very little about the artist. We don't know when he painted each work, we don't know the meaning of the work, but this hasn't prevented a great deal of research being done on the work and a lot of speculation, which I'll cover in the talk. What I'm going to do first of all is to put his work in the context of other artists of the period before going through some of his major works. So let's start with the late Gothic. Hieronymus Bosch was an early Netherlandish artist, and the style of those artists was a continuation of late Gothic, which in the 14th century became known as International Gothic, and it's mostly based on the work in illuminated manuscripts. Here's an example of International Gothic from perhaps the most famous of all of the illuminated manuscripts, the Très Richeur of the Duc de Berry. This is February. What we see is an enclosure surrounding a farm with a sheep pen. On the right, there are 4 beehives and a dovecot. Inside the house, a woman and a couple warm themselves in front of the fire. The detail I like is the unashamed way the couple lift up their clothes to warm their nether regions. Outside, a man chops down a tree with an axe. Bundles of sticks at his feet, while another gets ready to go inside on the right-hand side of the picture, blowing his hands to warm them. And further away, at the top of the picture, a third drives a donkey loaded with wood towards the neighbouring village. So let's look at the early Netherlandish artists, also known as the Flemish Primitives. They worked between about 1420 to the 1520s. Hieronymus Bosch died in 1516. By the way, in this context, the word primitive isn't pejorative. It means something like naive in the sense of pure and gentle. The Flemish Primitives were innovators. They brought in a new artistic tradition. They were active in the Burgundian, later Habsburg Netherlands, and operated in Bruges, Ghent and Brussels, which are all in present-day Belgium. And about this time, for the first time, artists began to have a very prominent position in society. Here we see 2 well-known early Netherlandish artists, Roger van der Weyden on the left, Descent from the Cross. He painted mainly religious subjects, and he was highly successful in his lifetime. His paintings were even exported to Italy and Spain, and he received commissions from the nobility like Philip the Good. By the latter half of the 15th century, he'd even eclipsed Jan van Eyck on the right. However, his fame didn't last as long. It lasted until the 17th century, and largely due to changing tastes, and in fact, the early Netherlandish artists were almost totally forgotten by the mid-18th century, and his reputation and their others were slowly rebuilt over the following 200 years. And today, Roger van der Weyden, together with Robert Campin and Van Eyck, are the 3 great early Flemish artists. Van Eyck was one of the first to use oil paints on panels and canvas, and his best known work is this one, the Arnolfini portrait in the National Gallery, or also of course the Ghent altarpiece. Oil painting, and a lot of the painting at this period was previously tempera, but oil painting had existed, but he and his brother Hubert took it to new levels and developed new techniques such as the use of glazes. Their style was greatly appreciated at the time, but as I said, it fell out of favour. It was appreciated in the 19th century by some artists like Eugène Delacroix, but it was not until 1902, when there was a major exhibition of the Flemish primitives in Bruges, widely attended, I think 35,000 people, and from that point on, in the 20th century, their reputation has continued to grow until the present day. I mentioned Robert Campin, one of the earliest Flemish primitives. Their work incidentally overlapped the Italian early and high Renaissance, but their work developed independently. They did have some influence on the Italian artists, but as I said, they were a separate style, a separate type of painting. Robert Campin was the first great master, also acclaimed in his lifetime. Born, we believe, in 1375 to 9. He worked in Belgium. He was the city's leading painter, the city of Tournai, for the next 30 years. And as he didn't sign or date his work, a lot of it is speculative. And he was influenced by the Limburg brothers. Oh, I didn't mention, it was the Limburg brothers that produced the Très Richard de Duc de Berry. And this is a portrait of an unknown man, and there's a companion piece, a portrait of a woman, so it's probably a portrait of husband and wife. Here in comparison is a portrait by Jan van Eyck, portrait of a man believed to be Van Eyck himself. He's wearing a fashionable headdress, fashionable then for men. The hood, which normally covers the shoulders, has been piled up on his head, and so it looks like a turban. On the right here, another of the early Netherlandish artists, Hans Memling. He was actually born in the Middle Rhine and moved to the Netherlands, where he entered the workshop of Roger van der Weyden, shown on the left. He was made a citizen of Bruges, where he became one of the leading artists in Bruges and master of a large workshop. That's Memling I'm talking about. And in 1480, he was listed amongst the most wealthiest citizens of Bruges. Incidentally, the Protestant Reformation of the 1520s resulted in the destruction of a lot of religious artwork, and Northern Renaissance art fell out of favour. It was collected by some monarchs like Mary of Hungary and Philip II of Spain, who favoured the work of Roger van der Weyden and Hieronymus Bosch, and also more broadly Albrecht Dürer. Then, as I said, they were largely forgotten, and it wasn't until the 1902 exhibition I mentioned, which was described as a turning point in the appreciation of early Netherlandish art. So, this is Hieronymus Bosch, born Jheronimus van Aken, as he was from Aachen. But notice it was drawn over 30 years after his death. So it may be an imagined likeness. This is another likeness that's produced even later. So it's possible that both are the invention of the artist. Now, Hieronymus Bosch was a Dutch, Netherlandish draftsman and painter from Brabant originally, which is a duchy within the Burgundian Netherlands, and consisted of 4 parts. Brabant was included Brussels, Antwerp and s-Hertogenbosch, and Bosch was born and grew up in an artistic family. His father and grandfather, 3 of his uncles, were artists, and so it's likely he was taught by his father, probably, or perhaps an uncle. And he was well known in his lifetime. He was collected in the Netherlands, Austria, Spain, and widely copied. And his representations of hell were the basis of a lot of forgeries, copies, and inspirations for other artists. But we don't know much about his life. We do know he spent most of it in s-Hertogenbosch, which means the Duke's Forest. He was born in his grandfather's house. Then, when he was at 38, he joined a highly respected international organisation called the Illustrious Brotherhood of Our Blessed Lady, which was important religious co-fraternity, or like a social grouping of artists and respected international senior figures, including the aristocracy. He was one of the 40 artists, but the outer membership was of 7,000 people, and so being one of the inner artists helped spread his reputation across Europe. And as I said, Philip II of Spain acquired many of Bosch's paintings, now in the Madrid, Prado, the Adoration of the Magi, which we'll see later, the Garden of Earthly Delights, the 7 Deadly Sins, the 4 Last Things, the Haywain Triptych. They're all in the Prado. And just before I move on to his work, it's generally organised into 3 periods, although the early period is from 1470 to 1485, and there are no authenticated works known from this period. The middle period, from 1485 to 1500, when he was 35 to 50 years old, there are some 7 works, and 13 from his late period. So not a lot of works in total, depending how you measure them, whether you regard triptychs as being separate works, and also the authentication of the works. He was widely influential. Peter Bruegel the Elder was one of his best-known followers, and highly individualistic, as we'll see. But just before I go on to his work, just a picture I found of the town he lived in, s-Hertogenbosch. It was this is a picture produced in the late Middle Ages. We don't know who the artist was. A time when the world was changing rapidly, and it was a flourishing city. This is the cloth market from around 1530, and it helps, I think, to enable in our imagination for us to travel back to the 16th century. Incidentally, in the foreground, the person with the halo is St. Francis, the patron saint of the cloth guild, and St. Francis is distributing fabric to the poor. Now, when Bosch was 30, he married Alet Goyets van der Meerveen, who was a few years his senior, and they moved into this house, which I've highlighted here, which was a house that was she inherited from her grandfather, and he spent most of his life walking from his home to his workshop, which was across the other side of the square. They remained childless. She outlived him by some 6 years, and in his later years his fame grew and he became quite wealthy. We know, for example, that he paid some 140 stivers in tax when the average was 12. This is a trailer for the Bosch exhibition, and I'm playing it to get you into the right mood for his work. Well, watching that brings it all back to me. I was lucky enough to visit the exhibition in the Prado in Madrid. Let's begin with what's believed to be an early Bosch painting. This is Adoration of the Magi. And like a lot of his paintings, experts disagree on how to interpret his paintings. In general, some argue that he was influenced by heretical ideas, and some say that his work had a strong entertainment element. It showed up the absurdity of some of the beliefs. But the most likely interpretation, and the one I think is correct, is that he was a serious, moralistic artist, and his work reflects the orthodox religious views of the period. He was the first artist to represent scenes that were created from his unconscious, and we'll see more of that later, because his work contains fantastical, complex images, and we find those picked up in the work of other artists later, even through to the 20th century, the surrealists who represented themes from the unconscious mind. Salvador Dali, for instance, studied Bosch and considered him a predecessor. However, at the time, I believe a lot of the scenes were interpretable, but much of the meaning of the symbolism is now lost. In this triptych, we can see the left panel depicts St. Peter, the one standing at the front, and one donor identified as Peter Bronkhorst, thanks to the presence of his coat of arms with the motto "One for All." In the background, there's a man sitting on a basket underneath a makeshift roofing. He's likely St. Joseph warming Jesus' clothes in front of a fire. In the right panel is St. Agnes of Rome standing, a virgin martyr, patron saint of girls and chastity, and she's depicted in art as we see here with a lamb, evoking her name, which resembles the Latin word for lamb, Agnus. The donor's second wife, Agnes Boshois, is shown accompanied by her coat of arms. Now in the middle, we see right in the background, it's been suggested that it's Jerusalem or Bethlehem. And then in front of it is a representation of the then currently, that is in Bosch's time, morally corrupt state of the Holy Land, and indirectly this could then be seen as a call for a crusade to free and purify the Holy Land. In the background there's two competing Mameluke armies in the centre panel, one on the left and one on the right, racing towards each other. But let's look at the centre panel in more detail. The three Magi are obvious, but who's the figure in the barn leaning out of the door? I'm referring to this figure here. It's been suggested it's the Antichrist, a sort of human form of Satan who falsely claims to be the Messiah. We can see there's Mary holding Jesus in her lap, and the upright stance of the donors, the saints and the Magi, and even the Magi's page, compares with the sort of unusual slouching pose of the Antichrist. Now, notice that his clothes are torn and falling off him, which signifies his deceitful nature. But looking at the Magi, Balthazar, the eldest, is kneeling, wearing a red cloak. He's placed his gift at Mary's feet alongside his helmet, and his gift is a table ornament made of gold and pearls and shows the sacrifice of Isaac, which prefigures the sacrifice of Christ on the cross to save mankind. It rests, incidentally, quite hard to see, but it rests on toads, which alludes to the sins from which we must be redeemed. The second Magi, Melchior, stands to the rear, offering Mary myrrh on a silver tray, and his metal cloak is decorated with the Queen of Sheba offering gifts to Solomon. The third Magi, dark-skinned Gaspar, holds a globe containing incense, and it shows, even harder to see in this picture, but it shows Abner kneeling before King David, and on top of the globe there's a phoenix gathering grain in its beak, referring to the resurrection of Christ, and the thistles on his shoulder allude to the passion of Christ. There are many incidents in the background. On the left panel, there's a man here lifting his tunic to expose his genitals to the woman, and three figures, I think, dancing in the background. On the right-hand panel, there's a woman being chased by a wolf, while a wolf is savaging a man nearer to us amidst a landscape of dead trees. In the centre panel, there's I mentioned the two armies, but back here there's a house with a flag, hard to see, but this flag here has a swan and there's a dovecot in the house, both of which would at the time clearly identify this as a brothel. To the right, there's a man pulling a horse with a monkey on it, referring to lust, and on a small hill above is a statue of a man on a column, which some think relate to the idols of Egypt that fell down as the Holy Family passed through. Christ mocked. The figures are crowded together in a very narrow picture plane, giving this sense of claustrophobia, oppression and domination. There's four evil-looking figures crowded around a meek and gentle Christ, and he seems to be looking out at us. He's the only one looking at us, asking us to share in his suffering. And the painting is based on descriptions from all the Gospels. For example, he's wearing a white robe, which is one of the meanings of the Greek word lampros, which in the King James's Bible is translated as gorgeous rather than white, gorgeous robe. The crescent of the figure bottom left represents the Ottoman Empire, and the yellow star is the yellow star of the Jews. And interestingly, in the underdrawing, we know that this man, bottom left, is spitting on Christ. Obviously, Bosch has toned down the painting, made it a bit more subtle in a way in the final painting. The man to the right seems to be tearing Christ's garment in reference to the text in the Bible. the chief priest tearing his own garments, or possibly Christ. It's ambiguous. The Saint Mark chapter 14:63. Then the high priest, rendering his garments, said, "What need we any further witnesses?" And his, I'm not sure whether it refers to the priest, his own garments, or to Christ's garments. The two men at the top are soldiers as they're wearing armour. One has an arrow in his headdress, and we know arrows like this were used by hunters to hamstring and cripple animals. He's using a gauntlet to protect his hands from the crown of thorns, and one has already started to penetrate Christ's scalp. The other man at the top right is wearing a spiked collar of the type worn by hunting dogs, and this might refer to Psalm 21:17. For many dogs have encompassed me. And all four are wearing clothes that were fashionable about 100 years before Bosch painted this, and so to viewers in Bosch's time they would have looked old-fashioned. This is the 7 deadly sins and the 4 last things. The 4 last things are the circles around the 7 deadly sins, attributed to Bosch or possibly a follower, because its authenticity has been questioned. On the one hand, the Bosch Research Conservation Project claimed it was by a follower, but scholars at the Prado, where the painting hangs, dismissed the argument. Whether it's by him or not, it's an important work. We see the 7 deadly sins, and what I'll do is I'll take you through them first, and then the 4 last things. But by the way, the inscription at the bottom translates as "Beware, beware, the Lord is watching." So the first deadly sin, gula or gluttony, a drunkard swigging from a bottle, a fat man eating greedily. Sloth, a lazy man dozing in front of a fireplace while Faith appears to him in a dream in the guise of a nun to remind him to say his prayers. Lust, 2 couples enjoy a picnic in a pink tent, and we know, or it would have been known at the time, what was to follow. 2 clowns are entertaining them. Pride, always associated with women looking in mirrors, and here the mirror on her wardrobe is being held in place by a demon. Then there's wrath or anger. There's a woman trying to break up a fight between 2 drunken peasants outside an inn. And we don't quite know. It probably refers to a saying at the time, but which we've lost. We don't know why the man who's a monk, the monk on the left, is wearing a table on his head. The man on the right has removed his cloak, and they both removed their hats. And the man on the right is drawn his sword, and the woman is trying to stop him using it. Envy. There's a couple standing in their doorway looking enviously at the rich man with a hawk on his wrist and a servant carrying his heavy load, while their daughter flirts with a man standing outside her window with her eye on the well-filled purse at his waist. And the 2 dogs there, I think, are illustrating a Flemish saying that we do know: 2 dogs and only 1 bone, no agreement. And then finally, greed, a crooked judge, that's the one just right of centre, pretending to listen sympathetically to the case presented by the party on his right, the left, while slyly accepting a bribe from the other party. If you can see, he's handing money to his hand. Then there's the four last things. This is death, shown with an angel and a demon while the priest is saying the last rites. Then judgment, Christ in glory while the angels awake the dead. Heaven, with Jesus and the saints in the centre. The gates of heaven, guarded by St. Peter, who's greeting the saved, while an angel on the left prevents a demon, far left, from ensnaring a woman at the last minute just before she enters heaven. And then finally hell shows the punishments meted out to sinners, starting at the bottom. Let's go round them clockwise. There's at the bottom pride, shows a woman with a toad on her genitals. Toads represent sexual desire. A devil holds a mirror in front of her, the usual representation of pride, a woman looking in a mirror. Lust is the red bed on the left, a couple in bed surrounded by demons. Then moving clockwise, gluttony, a man in a tent sitting at a table on which there's a collection of noxious animals that he's being forced to eat. Then envy at the far back, a group of figures attacked by wolves near a gallows scene. And then down below that, sloth is a person being punished by being hammered on an anvil. And then on the right at the top, anger is being punished by a man being dismembered with a sword. And then below that, greed. It's hard to see, but there's people being boiled together with their coins in a kettle over an open fire, while a man in front is being turned on a spit. This is Bosch's The Last Judgment and depicts the fall of humanity. In the left-hand panel, God looks down as fallen angels are being cast down. You can see them falling out of heaven, looking like insects. Down below, we'll go right down to the bottom. You can see God creating Eve from Adam's rib, and then above that there's Eve taking the fruit from the serpent in the tree of knowledge and handing it onto Adam. And then above that you can see them being cast out. The central panel shows the Last Judgment. You can see that it's almost like hell, that the world has been corrupt, riven with sin. And then on the right panel, the consequences of that hell. The painting's composition has some similarities with the Haywain Triptych and the Garden of Earthy Delights, which I'll talk a lot more about later. This is an interesting one. It's the cure of folly, or the extraction of the stone of madness. Incidentally, the interlaced gold ribbon around was a decorative style often found in illuminated manuscripts and miniatures of the period. The inscription in Gothic script at the top reads, I've translated it for you, "Master, rid me of this stone," and at the bottom, "My name is Lubert Das." And traditionally it was believed that madness was a result of a stone lodged in the brain. So naive people try to rid themselves of madness by having the stone cut out, and this is the operation taking place here. The patient is that stout elderly peasant whose clogs have been removed and is tied to the chair, And the surgeon is the man with the inverted funnel on his head, which incidentally signifies deception. So he is a charlatan. He's extracting not a stone, but it's a bit difficult to see, but it's a lily, a water lily, like the one on the table. And some have interpreted this as meaning that he's extracting money fraudulently. Others think he's extracting sexual desire and thus ridding the patient of lust to get him back onto the right Christian path. And that's reinforced by his name, Lubbert Das, which literally means castrated badger. And the badger, which sleeps during the day, was considered a lazy animal. And Lubbert was also a man's name. It was used as a nickname for fat, lazy and stupid people. The painting was actually commissioned by Philip of Burgundy, and we know it dates from 1488 by dendrochronology, which is a way that a lot of these paintings, which are nearly all, or I think all the ones I'm showing you, are on panel, wood panel. So we know the rough date. Let me explain why it's a rough date. Just take a brief aside to talk about dendrochronology. When it rains a lot, trees grow more in a rainy period and form a ring of growth that's wider than the rings that are laid down in dry years. So there's a sequence of wide, medium and narrow tree rings over the years corresponding to rainfall. So if we start with the tree ring sequences of trees of a known age, we can match them with older and older trees by looking for sequences until we end up with a complete sequence through a whole sequence of trees going back hundreds of years. Then if we take a wooden panel and look at the sequence of rings and their thickness, their width, and compare it with this sequence, we can date it to roughly the time the tree was cut down. Of course, the wood might not have been used immediately, so the date of the painting was at the earliest shortly after the tree was cut down, but it could be some time later. So it's a rough guide. Right, let's get back to Hieronymus Bosch. This is part of the pilgrimage of life, a allegory of, and consists of the allegory of intemperance, which is now at Yale, Death and the Miser, now in Washington, the Peddler in Rotterdam, and the Ship of Fools, which is in the Louvre. It's been split up. At some point before 1904, the triptych was dismantled and sawn up. The two front wings had the Peddler painted on them, were then joined together and cut to form an octagon. And the central panel that these were, that the Peddler, when you opened it up, appeared in front of you, is disappeared. They're all incidentally from the same tree, which is how we know these, what is now, after they've been sawn up, 4 works are all linked together. There are many different interpretations of this, as usual, starting with the Peddler on the outside doors of the panels of the triptych when they're folded closed. The Peddler's an itinerant trader carrying his goods on his back. You can see he's got a soup ladle, cat skins, bodkin and thread in his hat mean he's also a cobbler, and the holes in his clothes and his mismatched shoes indicate a life of poverty and misery. It's possible that he's just left the house behind him where he might have squandered all his money. Look at the house. By the door there's a caged magpie, a jug on a pole at the top, a dovecot, and the sign of a swan, which you remember signifies that this is a brothel. In fact, each one of those would have shouted brothel to the viewers at the time. The soldier at the door was seen at the time. Soldiers were seen as regular visitors to brothels, and the long rod by the door is his pike staff. Now the peddler has a bandage round his leg and may have been bitten by a dog, which was a constant danger. But there's another interpretation of this painting, and that is the peddler represents us all as we journey through life, facing constant temptations, and that the peddler has just walked past the brothel. So I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think is the most likely. Incidentally, the owl in the tree, I'll come back to the many possible interpretations of owls, but I think here it's a symbol of the devil and temptation. Looking at the painting on the right, in 1494 there was a book published called Ship of Fools, which was 100 short chapters describing sins, follies and transgressions of the foolish and the poor. But by the way, the middle class, who were those that commissioned these paintings and saw these paintings, were assumed that the poor were corrupt and would inevitably, all the poor would go to hell. And beyond that, the poor were regarded as good-for-nothing parasites and idlers. This view of the poor reached a peak in Netherlands in about 1525. So in the Ship of Fools, there is a ship, you can see, or a small boat, holding a group of merrymakers, including a monk and a nun, whose open mouths are coming together as they sing and lean forward to take a bite from what's hanging between them, which is either something like a loaf or a pancake, or possibly would be seen as an excuse for their lips to come together. There's an owl right up at the top of the mast. There's a man climbing up the mast to cut down some food, a roast fowl. The man was switching to the part of what was the same panel on the left, which is now at Yale, the Allegory of Intemperance, as it's now called. There's a man sitting astride a barrel, a man swimming in water with a dish on his head, and the dish contains a meat pie decorated with a bird's head, and his clothes have been left on the shore next to the tent. And inside the tent there's an aristocrat, and on top the aristocrat's coat of arms, surrounded by, hard to see, but it's a circle of pig's trotters indicating the debauchery within. And there are many illustrations at this time of high-born youths flirting, making music, drinking on boats, and these leisure activities are taken one stage further by Bosch and shown to depict debauchery, which the viewers would have known would lead them all to eternal punishment and damnation. So it's a warning. This is Death and the Miser, now in Washington. And it's an outer wing of a lost triptych. If we look at the panel, we can see a drama unfolding. There's a man sitting on his deathbed, an angel clasping his shoulder and pointing to the crucified Christ up in the window, and there's a beam of light coming down. But death is about to enter the room on the left, pointing an arrow at the dying man, but a demon is coming out from under the curtain by the bed, offering the dying man a bag containing precious coins. And so the man has to decide between earthly temptations and the salvation of his soul. The scene, incidentally, was inspired by a book, The Art of Dying, written in the early 15th century. And it was written to help people prepare for what was called a good death. I'm showing you this close-up because the Bosch research team brilliantly found an interesting twist in the underdrawing. Using infrared photography, they found that in the original underdrawing by Bosch, the miser is grabbing the bag of money in his right hand and has an expensive jar in his left hand. So it's almost as if he's been corrupted, and the angel therefore is trying to save him by pointing up to Christ, but the man isn't looking up to Christ. He's sort of looking halfway in between. But Bosch, in the final painting, has added ambiguity to the scene. He's just reaching out to the bag, but he hasn't grabbed it, so there's still hope. The man at the foot of the bed is possibly the alter ego of the man in the bed, and he's putting coins in a bag held by a rat-faced creature while holding a rosary in the other hand. So again, there's some ambiguity in this. Incidentally, the armour right in the foreground would typically stand for vainglory or pride or possibly anger. So it's been suggested that the whole triptych, if you look at the various elements, represent the 7 deadly sins. This is part of a panel of the Haywain Triptych. And again, we see a peddler. And this time I think it's clearer that he is well, let me explain what's going on. He's defending himself against a dog using a stick. He hasn't been bitten in this case. He's fought off robbers, and the robbers have caught someone that they're robbing in the tree and tied to a tree on the left. And he's left behind a couple dancing to bagpipes, and bagpipes represented lust at this time as a symbol of lust. So this suggests that the peddler is being used by Bosch as an exception to the fate of the poor, because the peddler is poor and the poor were believed to be on an inevitable path to hell, but by rejecting sin, shown as this vicious dog, and the seduction of dancing and the bagpipes, this peddler could be redeemed. Incidentally, again, dendrochronology gives an earliest date of 1510 with a likely date of 1512 to 15. And I mention that because this means that this work is likely to be one of his last works. The Haywain. In the central panel is a Haywain. This was the first occurrence in painting, but in songs in the 15th century, the Haywain was often used to represent different types of foolish behaviour that took place in and around Haywains. We can see here sins being committed. Incidentally, there's 2 versions of this. This is the Escorial version, the other's in the Prado, and it used to be thought that both were copies, but detailed scientific testing by the Prado has shown that theirs is the original. So this version in the Escorial is a copy. The left panel shows another expulsion from paradise, and the central panel shows what the human race has descended to after expulsion from paradise. Every sort of sin illustrated, as Isaiah 40 verse 6 says, all flesh is like grass and all its glory like the flowers of the field. Well, there was a Flemish proverb as well at the time which ran, the world is like a haywain and each man takes what he can. Right up above in the central panel we see Christ, while below everyone, including members of the clergy, are trying to grab pieces of the haywain, which again was symbolic of, it represented material goods. And no one seems to notice that the haywain is being driven by a devilish figure straight to hell, and following the haywain is the Pope, an emperor, the king, possibly of France, as he has the fleur-de-lis, and a Burgundian duke. The figure on the left at the bottom is the expulsion of Adam and Eve by the archangel. And at the bottom of the central panel we see everyday life, which is worth looking at in some detail, because there's a mixture of sins, but of everyday life as well. There's murder going on. Top right, a man is having his throat cut, but below him there's some women on the left looking after a child, and on the right there's a woman having her tooth pulled. It's referring to the murder that's going on above. It was at that time a very violent and dangerous place, worse even than the, leaving aside war, worse than even the worst areas of the world today. The average lifespan was 30, although I should say that although that figure's often quoted, it's a bit misleading because of the extremely high child mortality rate. A third of children died before they were 5. So if you could make it past your 5th year, then you'd probably live until you were 40 or 50. And there were a few people who lived till their 70s. On top of the haywain, there's 2 wealthy people listening to music played by the devil again, while an angel looks up to Christ above despairingly, and their servants are frolicking in the bushes behind. And then on the right is Bosch's view of hell, which is being constructed by devils, while an angel looks up to Christ despairingly. And there are minor differences between the underdrawing and the painting. Birds that have been added in the painting, a sword that's been added, and so on. So minor differences. The thing I wanted to, I'm not sure I've mentioned it before, but remember the early Netherlandish artist. You would have remembered that the painting was very smooth. You couldn't see the brush strokes. And although it looks that way with Bosch's work, that's because of the reproduction. If you look closely at his work, you can see that he uses more coarsely ground pigment than was used at the time, and a thicker impasto that creates a sort of surface texture that traps the light. And just a brief aside, about that word impasto. It's Italian, means dough or mixture. So it's when the artist uses a thicker paint that sort of comes out of the canvas, generally associated with oil painting, as tempera and watercolours are inherently too thin. And it's best illustrated by this painting by Rembrandt. And if you look at a close-up of Rembrandt's face, you can see the brushstrokes and the thickness of the paint. But at a distance, it adds expressiveness and an extra dimension in the way that it reflects light through the surface. Well, that was one of the innovations introduced by Hieronymus Bosch. And that takes me to the Garden of Earthly Delights. I was going to talk in detail about the Temptation of St. Anthony, but you can find that in my notes. But in order to spend longer on his most famous work, the Garden of Earthly Delights, I've skipped over the Temptation of St. Anthony. So, on the left is paradise, on the right hell, and in between our sinful world that inevitably leads to hell. And in the medieval mind, the real world is inevitably flawed and full of sin. And they believed that in our dreams, and this in a sense represents a dream world, in our dreams we are freed from the gross sin-ridden body, and they believe that dreams could be more truthful than our day-to-day senses when we are. So if we step back and analyse our dreams, it will show you a true picture of what the world's really like. Our desires during the day is what leads us astray. And incidentally, Bosch here is not really focused on the 7 deadly sins, but specifically on sex or lust. And although this triptych looks like an altarpiece, it's unlikely it was used as an altarpiece because of the explicit representation of sin in the central section. We know it was commissioned by, or we believe it was commissioned by Engelbert II of Nassau, and it was on display at Nassau. In the left panel, there's a young god at the bottom presenting or marrying Adam and Eve. In the central panel, there's a deep landscape full of nude figures engaged in self-absorbed sexual excess and joy, as well as fantastical animals, oversized fruit, these strange stone formations, and then on the right a hellscape showing what happens if you succumb to the temptations of evil. I should say at this point that a lot of what I've been saying represents the beliefs of Christians, and particularly the beliefs that were held at the time. I'm talking as if I'm talking in terms of my interpretation of these paintings rather than my beliefs. It's set at night, hell. The panel features cold colours, tortured figures, and here the nakedness of the figures has lost its eroticism that we see in the central panel. The central panel, as I said, is concerned with sex, with lust, but it also seems to be concerned with pleasure. Some people have said so that there's an argument about the interpretation. It either is a call to get people to wake up to the sin of lust or it's been suggested that the erotic images, particularly those in the central panel, were part of the reason it was commissioned. So on the left, at the top, there's a mountain landscape teeming with animals in the wake of God's creation. The natural world has burst into bloom. There's birds wheeling through the sky, and there's a wide variety of beasts that the contemporary viewer would have noticed the boar and its young on the right. But there's also exotic animals that people would conventionally not normally have seen, like in the centre, the giraffe and the elephant. Although Bosch may have seen, because it's fairly accurately represented, he may have seen an elephant at a fair. At the marketplace in s-Hertogenbosch, there was seal meat and seal furs, live animals even sold for slaughter. And also at this time there were books published called bestiaries, which showed pictures of exotic animals. So there were a lot of illustrations of these exotic animals, including fabled animals. You can see drinking at the pond on the left at the water's edge, there's a unicorn. So Bosch is paying homage to the miraculous and diverse quality of God's creation. Incidentally, one concerning note, if you look in the pink circle below that construction, that fountain construction, you'll see an owl signifying night and death. In the writings of St. Augustine, it became associated with heresy, although, as we'll see in a moment, there are many interpretations of the symbol. And so it's thought here that it's prophesying the fall of Adam and Eve, which at the bottom of the left-hand panel, we can see God blessing the new couple with the injunction, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it. Below Eve's feet, there's rabbits scurrying past, symbolising fertility. And in medieval man saw marriage and reproduction as being inextricably linked. In other words, sexual intercourse was intended only as a means to reproduce, not an act of pleasure or desire. The main panel, the central panel, which gave rise to the name of the work, the Garden of Earthly Delights, we can see there's a central pool, or the pool below the centre has women in the pool and men on a variety of beasts circling the women. The men are seated on all sorts of animals: horses, camels, unicorns, boars and other animals, carrying fruit, eggs, birds, perhaps intended as gifts for the women. It's a bit difficult to interpret. The one indication is that the men appear to have lost control and perhaps blinded by love and lust, because they have no reins to control their mount. And this might be a reference to St. Augustine, who wrote, "Let man control lust, let him hold the reins and not be carried away." Well, here they are being carried away. They have no reins. If we look at three of the animals on the right, there's a unicorn, which is a symbol of pride. The bear next is a body without faith. The ox in the next one round, anti-clockwise, for maddened lust. The women, incidentally, don't look particularly distressed. It could be that they are waiting to see what's going to happen next. It could be that they have control over the men. This circuitous route may have the same significance as Morris dancing, where men dancing around a single woman, or women dancing around a May tree. The unbridled lust would be seen here to lead them directly to hell. The 4 rivers above indicate the 4 points of the compass. The oversized fruit I mentioned we know a few of the symbolism. The cherry was a symbol of pride. Strawberries were regarded as too overindulgent and so liable to corrupt through excessive sensual pleasure. And there are various sayings at the time, one of which is, "Don't eat cherries with great lords, they'll throw the pits in your face." The birds here, that there are the whole assembly of birds, and many of which we can recognize the species of birds, and the birds itself, the fact there's a lot of birds has a double meaning. The obsolete plural form of the Dutch word for bird, vogelen, was also, we know, a reference to sexual intercourse. Top left, there's a pink structure which could represent heresy, as it's partly made of glass which is about to break and fall. And then there's even more obscure symbolism. For example, top left, there's a man holding a tree of life, riding a sea eagle. Suggested he might represent the extinction of the duality of the sexes, as he's halfway between heaven and earth. And then to his right, there's a knight on a fish with a dolphin's tail that curves back, suggesting a symbol of eternity, which is a snake biting its own tail. Again, something, eternity halfway between the earth and heaven. Here we see a couple in a glass bowl. There's a proverb at the time, pleasure is as fragile as glass. And here we see the glass bubble is emerging from a flower and is beginning to crack. Many of the popular songs and texts at the period make it clear, make some of the symbolism clear, but a lot has been lost. For example, songs at the time make it clear that prayer was a metaphor for sexual intercourse, which might seem strange, but songs describe how a monk would use prayer to seduce a nun, in one song, behind the altar. Another example, the man upside down with his hands with crossed thumbs and fingers touching. That particular way he's holding his hands was a gesture of prayer at the time. Above his legs is an exotic fruit suggesting forbidden pleasure, and possibly it's not too far-fetched to think that Bosch is referring to the sin of self-abuse, in other words, masturbation. Medieval moralists saw this as sin against nature and one of the worst possible sins. Top right is an owl, and I said I would come back to the owl because it's got many interpretations. And they illustrate the difficulty of interpreting these symbols. It depends on the context. According to St. Augustine, the owl, as well as representing night and darkness and heresy, was sometimes considered to be the symbol of Christ, the way Christ was born into the darkness of the world in order to bring light. Although today, and in the classical period, the owl represented Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and it's also there are references to owls in the Bible which suggest darkness, and the Latin word for owl, bubo, is also the Greek word for boil, hence bubonic plague, a plague indicated by boils. Owls were sometimes also used to represent Jews, as they were said to have rejected the light of Christ and lived in darkness. But not all representations were completely negative because of this association with Christ, who came and lived in darkness in order to save sinners. So it's complicated. The owl sits above a four-legged buffoon ensnared by the thorns of sin, proudly cavorting a ridiculous jig, I think is one way of seeing this. And at the top right, there are people picking apples from a tree, suggestive of the tree of good and evil, the tree of knowledge. And there's a man offering a giant strawberry to a woman with a sort of leering expression, a twist on the biblical depiction of Eden. The scene is one that is traditionally used to represent courtly love, yet here they're doing more than merely flirting. According to one critic writing about this painting, Bosch subverts and perverts the theme of courtly love with love fruit, a traditional metaphor for amorous union, both religious and worldly, now transformed into hellish prison. At the bottom centre, there are 5 figures, 4 white, 1 black. The fair-skinned figures, 2 males and 2 females. It's hard to see, but they're covered from head to foot in a light brown body hair, which some scholars think represent wild or primitive humanity, although no one can agree on the exact symbolism. It could be the savage, or the noble savage, is one uncorrupted by society. And then bottom right, in a sort of cave, there's the only clothed figure in the whole panel, and one of the few with dark hair, which suggested he's a particular person, and he's pointing at a hairy female figure. We don't know who it is, but it's possible it's a portrait of the patron, or possibly it's even a self-portrait of Bosch himself. On the right, City on Fire, a lot of his paintings of hell show a city on fire, maybe conjuring up childhood memories, because when Bosch was 13, there was an enormous fire raged through s-Hertogenbosch, and it destroyed 4,000 homes, just reduced them to ashes. So it may be that these images of hell, or includes this idea of people trying to escape and falling into the flames and being destroyed in this inferno, is something that he remembers from this fire when he was 13 years old. one of the most famous images, the tree man. At top left, there's a group of lost souls being squashed by a huge pair of ears with a knife wedged between them, and it's difficult. I mean, to some extent, with the knife appearing from between the ears, it looks a bit like a cannon with wheels, but it also, I'd have to admit, has similarities to the male sexual organ. The ears are pierced by an arrow, blood oozing from it, and knives, of course, were used as tools as well as in fights. And if you look on the knife blade, you'll see a letter B or possibly an M turned on its side. And this is a symbol that was stamped onto knives produced in s-Hertogenbosch. And it was one of the thriving industries of the town. In fact, it had international fame for its knives, and so Bosch could well be including this knife as a reference to his hometown. They were exported as far as Spain and Scandinavia, and they did have these symbols stamped on the side. But of course, a knife was used to cut off the ears from thieves. So chopping off ears was a common corporal punishment, and so to include that in hell is maybe just a simple reference to incorrigible kleptomaniacs. The tree man is perhaps the best known part of this image as a isolated image, propped up by legs that look like tree trunks. He's balanced, well, you can just about see it here. You can see the legs are balanced on two small boats. There's a group of people trying to find shelter. Inside his body, there's a tavern with a woman pulling pints from a barrel on the left, and a crossbow hanging from a tree. And then on the right, there's a table with people drinking. The man to the left of the table is sitting on a giant toad, representing, a toad was symbol for the devil. And on the top of the head of the tree man, there's a large bagpipe, instrument of representing lust, sloth and idleness. The tiny flag on his eggshell back also shows a bagpipe. Down the bottom of the right panel, there's music associated with lust. Music was called music of the flesh. We see a figure being crushed by a giant lute and another impaled by harp strings. The crushed figure on his buttocks has 4 lines musical stave tattooed into the skin. And I mean, today musical scores are written on 5 lines, so it's been a bit of a mystery what the music refers to. And several musical historians have tried to transcribe it into modern notation by regarding the second line as a C, common for chants at this period. And on the right, there's so much going on here, but on the right, there's this hellish bird, maybe an owl, acting like a demon, eating. It's got a pot on its head, jugs for shoes, sitting on a giant potty chair. Human bodies are being consumed and excreted simultaneously, going straight into the sewer. I should add that in medieval times, and so for example, in s-Hertogenbosch, there was a river that ran through the heart of the city, which was an open sewer, and only the very rich could afford a closet, a toilet, perched above the river. to relieve themselves in private, ordinary people would defecate straight into the river. So this elegant potty chair, painted by Bosch, would only be found in the homes of the wealthiest, and after his marriage he would become one of them. So it's quite likely he had a similar chair taking pride of place in his house. On the edge of the sewer we see three figures: one, rich stinker excreting coins. To his right there's a figure throwing up. And these, I said the main sin being depicted was sin, or sex I should say. This sin could be gluttony and greed. Just to show a closer close-up of the woman under the chair, she has a toad on her chest representing the devil, which in this case represents sexual excess. The mirror in front of her represents pride. The ass alongside her represents foolishness. And there was a Flemish saying mothers used to tell their daughters who preen themselves in front of a mirror: "You are looking up the devil's arse." Her eyes are closed, perhaps signifying that in hell, understanding where pride has led her, she can no longer bear to look at herself. Even the green man tree hybrid has a meaning, as greenery and foliage represented the shortness of life. So, with the right panel, we've come to the end of the story of Hieronymus Bosch. Did he set out to shock, to educate, to amuse, to surprise us? We don't know, but with his multitude of figures, animals, plants and objects, there's certainly lessons to be learned. In 1517, which is a year after he died, Antonio de Betis, who was travelling around Europe, was the first to write about this work, the Garden of Earthly Delight, because he saw it in the House of Nassau in Brussels, the house in which the person who commissioned it lived. And from there, Bosch's reputation, which was already, he was well known and selling works across Europe, but his reputation increased even more quickly, and he became famous across Europe. Undoubtedly, this triptych is one of the most remarkable paintings ever made. It's a testament to boundless creativity. Just look at the tree man on the right there with its fantastical architecture. We'll never be able to grasp its meaning, but we can definitely say it's an unparalleled work of art, an amazing visual spectacle. He died on the 9th of August 1516. We don't know how he died, what he died of, but pleurisy ran rampant that year. We know many people died in the epidemic, so it's likely that he died of pleurisy. But I will leave you with some words from a famous art historian, Erwin Panofsky. He wrote in his book Early Netherlandish Painting, and I quote: "In spite of all the ingenious, erudite and in part